After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now, the last story we read in chapter 6 took place in Galilee, but not many of the stories in John do. John is mainly focused upon the things that Jesus did in Judea, and it's rather uncharacteristic for him to give very much information about things Jesus did in Galilee, especially things that are already recorded in the other three Gospels, because there's there's minimal overlap between John's Gospel and the other three, and yet he has told us this story of the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, in order, no doubt, to set the stage for the discourse about the bread of life, which really took up much more time in that chapter than the telling of this miracle. And that was in Galilee. And so John tells us that Jesus at this time stayed in Galilee for a while. We don't know how long. Well, I guess we do know how long, because this was around Passover. Chapter 6 was around Passover. And we will now see in verse 2 that the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand here. That's exactly 6 months after Passover. And it's exactly 6 months before Passover, of course. It's right in the middle between one Passover and the next. The Passover was on the 15th day of the first month of the Jewish calendar, and the Feast of Tabernacles on the 15th day of the 7th month of the calendar. So there are exactly 6 months between these feasts either direction. And since Jesus was going to die on the Passover after this, we now come to a point just 6 months before his death, and 6 months after the feeding of the 5,000. So that 6 months, it basically says he stayed out of Judea, because it says the Jews sought to kill him. Now, the Jews here would mean the Judeans. He himself was a Jew, of course, and so were his disciples. Not all Jewish people sought to kill him, but the Jews, in this context, is in contrast to Galileans. Jesus and his disciples were Galilean Jews, but the Judeans were much more under the control of the Sanhedrin and of the chief priests and the Pharisees, who were Jesus' enemies and who were just murderous enough to want to kill him. Now, the fact that they wanted to kill him was stated back in chapter 5. Apparently, the last time he had been in Jerusalem before this coming time that we're about to read of. And we see in verse 18 of chapter 5, therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. So the breach of Sabbath and also what appeared to them to be blasphemy had made them determined that he should die. He's done things worthy of death. In fact, in the Old Testament, a person would be put to death for breaking the Sabbath and for blasphemy. They had the law on their side, in a sense, if the charges could be made to stick. Of course, the only way Jesus could really be charged with breaking the Sabbath is if he was not, in fact, the Lord of the Sabbath, as he said he was. If he was the Lord of the Sabbath, then his observance of the Sabbath was basically up to him. And if God really was his Father, then the charge of blasphemy would not stick, because what they were charging him with was saying God was his Father. Well, that's not blasphemy if it's true. But if these charges were true and could stick, then they would be punishable by death, and therefore the Judeans, who were finding him particularly difficult, because he did not ever say flattering things about them, but usually very harsh things about them, they saw him as undermining their power base, and so they wanted to kill him. So verse 2 of chapter 7 says, now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. His brothers therefore said to him, depart from here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For even his brothers did not believe in him. Now, it's not entirely clear what their thinking was. Either they thought that Jesus did want to start a popular revolution against Rome, as most of the Jews hoped the Messiah would do. And therefore they're saying, well, you're not going that way very fast. You haven't raised an army. You haven't done much This is a good opportunity. Go down to Jerusalem for the feast. There'll be a lot of pilgrims there from all over the world, Jewish people. You can go and do your works there and gather a lot of popular support. And then you can do your militia thing. You can do your war against Rome thing. And if so, they were apparently mocking him. Now, it's also possible that they were even questioning whether he did miracles. It says, if you do these things, why don't you show it openly? Now, remember, these brothers of his were in Galilee, in Nazareth in particular. Jesus did miracles throughout Galilee, but not in Nazareth. At least nothing very impressive. He had gone to Nazareth twice. The first time he preached in the synagogue there, and he told them that they would no doubt wish for him to do miracles among them as he had done in Capernaum and other places. But he said, a prophet is without honor in his own country, and their lack of faith prevented him from doing very much among them. So, although Jesus was doing miracles, his brothers quite possibly had never seen one, since they were in Nazareth, and that's one place he didn't do them. And he had gone there a second time, apparently, in his ministry, and also the same problem. He didn't do many mighty works there because he marveled at their lack of faith. His brothers even lacked faith. His hometown and his family seemed to lack faith in him. Well, what about Mary? She certainly shouldn't lack any faith. And yet we read in Mark chapter 3 that even she seems to have had her moments. Maybe not lacking faith, but at least questioning whether Jesus was really on the right track. In Mark chapter 3, verses 20 and 21, it says, and the multitude came together again so that they could not so much as eat. That is, Jesus and the disciples were so busy with ministry that they could not stop to take meals. But when his own people heard about this, that's his own family and his own relatives, they went out to lay hold on him, for they said, he is out of his mind. He's obsessed with this mission that he's on. He won't even eat. And so it would appear that his relatives said he was out of his mind. Who? Which relatives? Well, a few verses later, Jesus is teaching in a crowded house, and verse 31 says, then his brothers and his mother came, and standing outside, they sent to him, calling him. Now, this is apparently the relatives who, in verse 21, had decided they better go collect him up because he's out of his mind. And so his mother and brothers show up, and they call for him. They can't get to him because the crowd is around him, so they send a message up to him. And a multitude was sitting around him, and they said to him, look, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. But he answered them, saying, who is my mother or my brothers? And he looked around in a circle at those who sat about him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and mother. Now, at this point, he seems almost to be disowning his family and saying, this is my new family. These, my disciples, whoever does the will of my Father, they are my family now. And by implication, my mother and my brothers who are outside are not doing the will of my Father. And therefore, I do not recognize them as my family any more than these around me. Now, of course, those who think that Mary was beyond sinning would possibly say that she was not one that was, thinking he was out of his mind, but she was concerned about him and wanted to get him some R&R and so forth, and she wasn't really sinning. But his statement seems to imply that the people outside asking for him, who were his biological family, were not doing the will of his Father. And he said, these around me who do the will of my Father, they are my mother and my brother and sister. In other words, at least he's saying that anyone who believes is as much a relative of his as his mother is. He certainly did not put his mother above all the saints or very close to his own level, but he put all saints on her level when she's doing well, when she's doing the will of the Father. When she's not, then she's below that level, because only those who do the will of his Father does he recognize as his family. So here we see his brothers again. It's directly stated they don't believe in him. Now, just so you'll know the sequel to this, they later did believe in him. On the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 1, we find the listing of the 12 apostles and others who were among the 120 in the upper room, and it says, and Jesus' mother and his brothers were there. They had become believers after the resurrection. How? Well, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tells us what actually no place else tells us in the whole Bible, and that is that when Jesus rose from the dead and was appearing to Peter and others, he made a special appearance to his brother James, his oldest brother. James, apparently as the oldest brother, seeing him resurrected, came to be a believer and was able to persuade the younger brothers that it was true. And so we find the brothers of Jesus not only becoming believers, but in some respects taking leadership in the church. Not top leadership. The apostles held that role. But James, the brother of Jesus, kind of filled into the position as the leader of the church in Jerusalem after the 12 were dispersed. And he also wrote the book of James. And Jude, another brother of Jesus, wrote the book of Jude. So these brothers here who were mocking him and didn't believe in him, later wrote scripture. So it's kind of nice to see that kind of a turnaround here. Now, they were telling him you ought to go down and promote your movement. I remember it says in chapter 2, there were a lot of people who believed in him, but he wouldn't commit himself to them because he knew what was in man. He certainly wasn't going to commit his mission to the oversight of these brothers who didn't believe in him. And he said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. What he means by that is, I don't actually move on my own will. I have to move when my Father tells me to go. You can do anything you want because you don't follow your Father. Your time is always at your own disposal. You can go anytime you want. But it's not time for me to go down there right now. And so I can't go because you suggest it, but you can go. He said, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. Now they were telling him to go and show himself to the world. That's what they said in verse 4. If you do these things, go show yourself to the world. You want to get the world to follow you. You want to get a big following, go show yourself to the world. He says, the world hates me. You can go anytime you want because it doesn't hate you. You're not telling them what they don't want to hear. You just fit right in. In fact, you're part of the world. But I'm not part of the world. I'm testifying against the world. And they hate me. So I'm not going to go show myself to the world and get myself strung up prematurely here. He says, you go up to this feast. I am not yet going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. Now, the King James and the New King James have the word yet, not yet. However, in many manuscripts it says, I am not going. And that bothers some people because most modern translations have it that way, following the other Greek manuscripts that just have him saying, I'm not going to this feast. And yet we read, of course, in verse 10, when his brothers had gone up, he also went up to the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret. So if you read a translation that says, I'm not going to this feast, and then it says, and then he went up when they were gone, secretly, it sounds like he lied to them. Like he said, go on up, I'm going to stay home. And then as soon as they're gone, around the first corner, he sneaks off and secretly goes anyway. So he deceived them. But that's not necessarily the case. There's kind of almost equal manuscript evidence for the inclusion or the not the inclusion of the yet. I'm not yet going up would mean not at the moment. You go on ahead whenever you want. It's not my time yet. My time has not fully come. When it comes, I'll go. But it's not yet. And in fact, that could be implied even if the word yet is not there, because it's in the present tense. I am not going means that's not happening right now. It's present tense. I am not going. It's not future tense. He didn't say, I'm not going to go. He says, I'm not going at the moment. That's not what's happening. So he didn't really lie. He just said, you go on ahead. I go when it's my time and not before. That's all he's saying. And we don't know how much time elapsed after they went. It skips to the time when he then went. But he went quietly and did not show himself to the world as they suggested, but he went there essentially to, well, he was going to show himself publicly in about the middle of the feast. The feast was 8 days long. Feast of Tabernacles. And it was a feast in which the Israelites were supposed to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem from wherever they lived and camp out there for a week. And they camped out in the streets on this particular feast. That's why it was called Tabernacles or booths, Sukkoth. Sukkoth in Hebrew means booths or tabernacles. And a tabernacle, of course, is a temporary structure, like the tabernacle that the Jews moved through the wilderness about as a portable structure. But a tabernacle is a tent, essentially, though in many cases they didn't bring tents to Jerusalem. They made booths out of branches and such. And it was a camp out. It was actually a fun time for the kids. The Jewish children liked Sukkot because they could go and have a camp out, you know, with their family in Jerusalem. And this is what they did to commemorate the years of wandering that their ancestors had spent between Egypt and the Promised Land. The 40 years they wandered in the wilderness were commemorated each year by the Feast of Booths. It was also timed in the year to coincide with the harvest of the fruit crops. The harvest of the grain crops was earlier in the late spring and early summer. But Sukkoth was at the end of the summer, in the early fall. And that was the fruit, the grapes especially, and the figs, the main products of Israel. They would ripen in the late summer and be harvested, so that the Sukkoth became also a celebration of the harvest. Harvest celebrations in most societies are very great festive things, because almost all societies until modern times were agrarian, and they worked all year to get their food supply for the next year. And they watched it grow, and of course, until it was ripe, they weren't sure what would happen. They weren't sure if locusts would get it, if there'd be a drought. But at the end of the season, when everything's ripe and they harvest it in, they can breathe a sigh of relief. You know, all our labor for the year is not in vain. We've got our food supplies for the next year stored up. And they just say, okay, now we're essentially finished the year's work. Let's take some time off and celebrate. So they have these festivals. So that's what Passover was. It was a harvest. Also, actually not so much harvest there. The first fruits were waved at Passover, first fruits of the barley. But it wasn't until Pentecost that the grain harvests were brought in. And then Tabernacles was when the fruit harvests were brought in. It was sometimes called a Feast of Ingathering for that reason. But it was 8 days long. And there were certain ceremonies associated with Tabernacles that we'll allude to later on, because Jesus seems to make reference to them in a certain vague way. But he did go down, it says, after his brothers were gone. He also went up to the feast. And this was apparently the last time he saw Galilee, where he grew up. It was 6 months before his death, but we have no record of him going back to Galilee after this. He came down, and instead of going back to Galilee after this, he went over to Transjordan, area that Josephus referred to as Perea. And so scholars sometimes refer to it as Perea. He did some Transjordanian ministry on the other side of the Jordan River, outside the country, to avoid arrest, really, prematurely. This was 6 months before his death. And so he goes down there, and he hides, for the most part, until the middle of the feast. Now we get some information about the talk on the street about Jesus at this time. Jesus had become very controversial in Jerusalem, and even the people on the street, for the most part, knew who he was and knew that he was controversial. In fact, they knew that the leaders of Israel had told people not to talk about him. And so people talked about him quietly, under their breath. They didn't talk openly. It says they were afraid to. But we find that there were mixed opinions about him. In fact, one thing this chapter illustrates more than almost anything else is how many different opinions there were and how confused people were about him. We are told that there was a division among the people because of him in verse 43, and we can see as we read through it a number of ways that they divided over different opinions they had of him. So even though people weren't really allowed to talk or free to talk openly about him, all the buzz on the street was about him. Now we have to remember this is a festival when people from out of the area are also coming to Jerusalem. Not just the locals, but people from other countries. Jews from all over the world would come to pilgrimage at the Feast of Tabernacles. So not everybody in town was equally familiar with who this guy was that was being discussed. And you'll find that there's different degrees of knowledge and ignorance that these people have, no doubt corresponding with the degree to which they had, that they were locals or not. The local people seem to know that the chief priests and Pharisees had put out a word that people should not believe in him, that they should turn him in if they see him, that there was a contract out for him. But there were people who came from out of the area who wouldn't even know who he was because they live in other countries and were hearing about him for the first time at this time. So the Jews sought him at the feast and said, "Where is he?" And there was much murmuring among the people concerning him. Some said, "He is good." Others said, "No, on the contrary, he deceives the people." So this is the main division between the people over him. Some liked him and some didn't. Some thought he was good. Certainly seemed like a good man. Went on healing people and feeding people and raising up dead people and so forth. Seems good. But others said, no, he's a deceiver. And of course, it is always possible that good deeds can be done by someone for a deceptive purpose. We know that, in other religions besides Christianity, there are good deeds done by people, even some that seem miraculous at times. There might even be miracles done in other religions from time to time. They certainly claim them. But this does not mean that the people who are not deceiving you. The devil himself can deceive. People sometimes say, well, if you go over to Manila and you go visit one of these Filipino psychic healers who, they reach into your body and remove cancerous tissue and pull out their hand. There's no mark, but they're holding a cancerous tumor out of your side. This kind of thing happens over there. And it's either trickery, as most skeptics assume, or else it's demonic. Now, somebody say, well, how do you know it's not God? Well, because they're practicing occult arts. And while God, of course, can use those, he doesn't support them. And therefore, someone might say, well, why would the devil cure people? Isn't the devil mean? Why would the devil cure people of their cancer and stuff like that? That sounds like the work of God. Well, it is the rightful work of God to do that kind of thing. But the devil is a deceiver. And he's not likely to get many followers if he only does things that people don't like. To bring people in, doing deeds that look good, may prove to be the necessary means of deceiving people into following his movement. And so they thought maybe Jesus was like that. After all, Moses had said in Deuteronomy 13, verses 1 through 3, Moses had said, if there arises among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he gives you a sign or a wonder, whereby he says, let us go after other gods that you've not known, and the sign or the wonder comes to pass. Says, you should not believe that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, because the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So Moses said that there might be false prophets that would come and give true signs that really occurred. But if their message is, let's go worship other gods, then they are deceivers and you should not follow them. Now, certainly the Pharisees and other religious leaders tended to feel that Jesus was leading people away from the pure religion of Judaism, because he seemed to them to be breaking the Sabbath, he seemed to them to be blaspheming, he seemed to them to be undermining the authority of, they thought, undermining the authority of Moses. And therefore his signs and his wonders they might interpret to be those of a false prophet who's giving a sign or a wonder to lead you away from God. And so some were interpreting his miracles and his teachings as good things, showing he's a good man. Others thought, no, this is just a deception. It's an elaborate deception. But verse 13 says, however, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. Now about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. So he finally breaks cover and comes out and teaches in the temple. Now rabbis did this. There was the outer court of the temple had various areas, booths. They were called pitches, where a rabbi could sit down and have disciples gather around him, or anyone who's curious, and teach. This is probably the kind of thing that Jesus entered when he was 12 years old. And his parents found him discussing the law with the teachers of the law. Probably one of these kinds of discussions going on. And Jesus, now as an adult, sits in the temple. And in fact, he did that, as we find, every time he was in Jerusalem. He availed himself of the temple as a place to do public teaching. And probably miracles too. And so he sat in the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled, saying, "How does this man know letters, having never studied?" Now, they're not asking how is it that he's literate. Literacy was not unusual among Jews. Actually, almost all Jewish boys had at least the equivalent of what we'd call a 6th or maybe 8th grade education. All Jewish boys, unless there was some reason that they couldn't, would go to the synagogue and be taught how to read and write and memorize Scripture. So knowledge of Scripture and the ability to read and write is not the thing they marveled at. That was not so unusual. What they're talking about is the word letters. Having never learned this letters is a reference to the writings of Moses and, of course, the interpretations of them given by the rabbis. Usually, if somebody was a teacher in Israel, they had sat under another teacher. They had discipled or been a protege of some mentor. As, for example, Saul of Tarsus was before he was a Christian. He was a protege of Gamaliel, a rabbi. But Jesus had never sat under a rabbi. He just appeared and had what everyone recognized as rather profound things to say. And they marveled and said, where did he learn this? How does he know these things? And Jesus answered them and said, "My doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me." So he's saying, now the word doctrine, by the way, it just means teaching. The King James and the New King James use the word doctrine. A modern translation might just use the word teaching. My teaching is not my own teaching. It's the teaching that the Father is giving through me. So that's answering the question that they were murmuring. How does he know how to do this? Well, frankly, I don't. My Father does. I'm teaching what my Father tells me, what my Father reveals to me. It's not what a rabbi taught me, it's what God taught me. He's God trained. And he, of course, indicates here that his teaching is reliable as God's own words. And of course, if someone was skeptical about that, he says in verse 17, if anyone wants to do his will, he shall know concerning the teaching, whether it is from God or whether I speak of my own authority. He claimed that his teaching was not from man, but from God. He says, now, you may doubt that, but you can know, and you will know. If you are one of those few who want to do the will of God, then he will let you know. You will discern that my teaching is from God. So that discernment of the words of God is not something that comes so much from theological training or the learning of letters. It comes from having a heart that's obedient to God, of which there were not that many in Israel at that time. There was a remnant, and that remnant heard and understood him and knew that he was speaking from God. And later on in chapter 10, he makes the same point, only in different terms, saying that his sheep hear his voice and know him and recognize him. He says the sheep don't follow a hireling, they follow the true shepherd. And so he actually develops that in the early part of John chapter 10 about how he's the shepherd, and the people who follow him are like his sheep because they recognize his voice. They're really God's sheep, and God has given them to Christ. So he's saying there are people who are obedient in their heart to God, and they recognize that what I'm speaking is from God. The rest of you, I'm not even hoping that you'll know that my teaching is of God, because you don't really, of course, know, but you don't want to do his will. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Now this is a generic statement, but of course he's speaking about himself, but it's true generically. The person who speaks from his own authority, and not many rabbis did, by the way, that person be seeking his own glory. He's trying to elevate himself. You see, the rabbis generally did not speak on their own authority, did not even claim to. Originality of teaching was not a value that the rabbis esteemed very much. You might think, when you hear Bible teachers who always want to have some new wrinkle, some new insight that no one's ever heard, that a teacher would like to have something original to say that everyone can say, oh, did you come up with that yourself? Yeah. They think, wow, you're a good thinker. Wow, you're really original. Well, originality was not esteemed among the rabbis. They always wanted to be able to quote other earlier rabbis to back up everything they said. In fact, some famous rabbis were quoted as saying, I've never said one word that was not previously said by other rabbis. That was their boast, that they were not deviating from the tradition of those before them. They would never speak on their own authority and just say, this is the way it is. They would say, Rabbi so-and-so has said that this is the way this law should be understood. Although Rabbi so-and-so B, he has another opinion about this. This is what he says. And they would give the opinions of rabbis, but they would never give their own opinion. And that is why when Jesus taught, we have often read, especially in the Synoptic Gospels, that when Jesus taught, the people marveled because he spoke as one who has authority and not like the scribes.